Story number 1.
The summer I turned 21, I took a job as a groundskeeper at a summer camp called Pineval. It sat on the edge of a long, narrow lake in upstate New York, surrounded by thick pine forest and steep hills. The camp had been around since the 50s, but business had declined over the years. Fewer kids, fewer counselors. The owners, a retired couple named Harold and Marlene, hired a handful of college students each year to help maintain the grounds and assist with activities. I needed the money and didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I looked forward to it. I arrived in early June before the campers did. The place looked exactly like an old horror movie set. Rusted swings, cabins with peeling red paint, a dining hall that smelled of mothballs and old wood. It should have creeped me out, but it didn't. At first, there were 6 of us hired that summer. 3 counselors, 2 kitchen workers, and me. We stayed in a staff cabin at the north end of the camp, near the maintenance shed. During orientation, Harold gave us a tour and rattled off a list of chores. Rake the leaves, fix the dock, clear out the hiking trails. He was friendly but tired-looking, always rubbing his temples. Marlene didn't say much. She mostly handled the kitchen and barely made eye contact with any of us. The first few days were easy. I mowed lawns, replaced light bulbs, patched holes in screens. At night, we'd sit around the fire pit and drink cheap beer we kept hidden under the floorboards. The others were nice enough. Kate, one of the counselors, was the outgoing type, always cracking jokes. Logan was quiet but observant, and Leah, the other counselor, spent most of her free time journaling. Things started to feel off during the second week, a few days before the kids arrived. One morning, I was clearing branches from the trail that led into the woods behind the camp. It was long and winding, eventually connecting to an old lookout spot called Fire Point. About half a mile in, I spotted something strange wedged between 2 rocks near the trail, a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox. It had no hinges or handles, just a sliding lid and what looked like red thread wrapped around it. I should have left it alone. I know that now. But curiosity got the better of me. I slid the lid open and immediately felt a chill crawl up my spine. Inside were dozens of small bones, animal bones maybe, but cleaned and arranged into a pattern. There were also 3 wax dolls, crudely shaped and wrapped in cloth. One of them had a nail through its head. Another had its limbs tied together. The third had red thread sewn across its mouth. I closed the box and stepped back, breathing hard. Something about it felt wrong, like I had interrupted something that didn't want to be disturbed. I took a picture on my phone and reburied the box under the rocks, then hurried back to camp. That night, I showed the photo to Logan. "Probably some kid's prank," he said, but he didn't look convinced. People do weird stuff in the woods. Kate made a joke about forest witches, but Leah stared at the picture for a long time without speaking. Finally, she said, "We should stay out of that part of the trail. Some things you leave alone." The rest of us laughed, but I noticed Leah folded the photo into her journal and kept it. I couldn't tell if she was scared or fascinated. The campers arrived 2 days later, 40 kids ages 8 to 12 crammed into musty cabins and swarmed the campgrounds like ants. For a while, the weirdness faded into the background. I got caught up in fixing toilets and hauling firewood. The kids kept us busy. But then things started happening. Small things at first, kids complaining of nightmares, items going missing from the cabins, weird symbols scratched into trees. One morning I found a dead squirrel nailed to the back of the maintenance shed. Its eyes had been removed, and its mouth was stitched shut with red thread. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just cleaned it up and tried to forget. But I couldn't, especially after one of the boys went missing. His name was Eli, 9 years old, quiet, always carrying a stuffed bear around. His counselor reported him missing after lunch one afternoon. The whole camp went on alert. We scoured the trails, the lake, the cabins, nothing. I remembered the box in the woods and felt sick. The police were called. Drones searched the forest. Dogs were brought in. Still nothing. Eventually, they assumed he wandered off and fell somewhere deep in the woods. A tragic accident. The camp closed for the rest of the week. The kids were sent home. Most of the staff left too. I stayed. So did Logan and Leah. And Kate, though she seemed more reluctant. Harold and Marlene barely spoke during that time. Harold walked the grounds like a ghost. Marlene just stayed inside the kitchen, chain smoking. That night, Leah asked to see the photo again. I showed her, and she stared at it like she was trying to solve a puzzle. I saw a symbol like this in one of the cabins, she said, pointing to the mark carved into the side of the box, above one of the beds. Are you serious? She nodded. It's not from the kids. It was too precise. Too old. I remembered the symbols on the trees and realized they matched too. That night, Logan and I walked out to the trail with flashlights. We found the spot again easily. But the rocks had been moved. The box was gone. In its place was something else. A ring of dead birds arranged in a circle, all headless. In the center was a single red ribbon tied around a tooth. I backed away, bile rising in my throat. Logan said nothing, just stared. We agreed not to tell anyone. Not Leah, not Kate, definitely not Harold or Marlene. But the next night, something scratched at our cabin door. It was around 3 a.m. We were all asleep until the noise woke us, slow, deliberate scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, but no one was there. I swept the light across the clearing. No footprints, no wind, just trees swaying in silence. The next day, Kate said she saw Eli. We were all sitting at breakfast when she dropped her spoon and said it, deadpan. I saw Eli, last night. He was outside, by the fire pit. I asked if she was sure. She nodded. But it wasn't right. His eyes were wrong, like glass, and he was smiling, not moving, just smiling. We searched the grounds again. Nothing. That afternoon, Leah found something at the base of the old pine near the staff cabin. A wax figure, identical to the ones from the box. This one had its head cracked open. Inside was something soft and black. We burned it. That night, Leah sat by the fire and told us she had dreams every night now. Of being chased through the woods, of voices whispering in languages she didn't understand. She said one of the voices called her name. Logan didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch with a knife in his lap. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening for footsteps. Around 2 a.m. I heard them. Crunching leaves, someone walking just outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. They passed by slowly, deliberately. I heard them circle the cabin and stop behind the wall near my bed. Then came the tapping. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. In the morning, there was a single red thread tied around the doorknob. Kate left that day, packed her bags and walked to the road. Harold didn't try to stop her. Neither did we. That night, Leah said she had a plan. There's something binding this place, she said. Something old. I think it feeds on fear. It needs offerings. I asked what kind of offerings. People, she said. It took Eli. It's trying to take more. It's trying to take more. She wanted to destroy the original site, dig up whatever was buried there, break the cycle. Logan and I agreed. We hiked back that night with shovels and flashlights. Leah led us. The clearing was quiet, the air cold. We dug where the box had been. At first, just dirt and stones. Then something hard, wood. It was a crate, larger than the box I found, sealed tight. We pried it open. Inside were bones. Human bones, small, dozens of them. Some were burned, others had symbols carved into them. Then we heard it. Footsteps in the woods, dozens of them surrounding us. We backed away, flashlights shaking. The woods flickered. Shadows moved between the trees. Logan dropped his light and swore. Leah knelt and poured gasoline over the crate. She lit a match. The flames rose instantly. The sound stopped. Everything went still. Then the wind came, sudden, violent, whipping through the clearing and almost knocking us down. The fire spread fast, crawling through the grass, up the trees. We ran. The fire department arrived hours later. The blaze destroyed several acres. No one asked what caused it. No one wanted to know. The camp closed permanently. Harold and Marlene moved to Florida. Logan and I never spoke again. Leah disappeared a year later. No warning, no trace, just gone. Sometimes I dream of the lake, of the trees, of a child's voice calling from the woods. Sometimes I wake up to tapping at the window 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Story the end.
Story number 2.
Summer in the countryside was always a time for exploring, for finding hidden spots, and for trying to escape the dull routine of city life. Jamie had spent every summer of his childhood at his grandparents' old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. There was a freedom there that was rare in the bustling city where he lived with his parents. The house was perched on a hill surrounded by woods, with only the occasional neighbor or distant sound of traffic reminding him that civilization was not far. But it always felt like another world. This particular summer was different, though. Jamie was 17 now. And as much as he enjoyed spending time with his grandparents, he had outgrown the quiet small-town life. He still went through the motions, pretending to enjoy the days filled with fishing trips and barbecues, but deep down, he was itching for something more, something to break the monotony. That's when he met Tommy. Tommy was a few years older than Jamie, the son of a neighbor who lived just a couple of miles down the road. He was the kind of guy who had a reputation for being a bit of a troublemaker, always getting into things he probably shouldn't have. But there was something about Tommy that intrigued Jamie. Maybe it was his confidence, or maybe it was the way he seemed to know exactly how to push people's buttons. Whatever it was, Jamie found himself drawn to Tommy's adventurous spirit. One evening, Tommy showed up at Jamie's grandparents' house with a mischievous grin on his face. "Hey, you want to do something?" he asked, leaning against the porch railing with a cigarette dangling from his lips. Jamie was sitting on the porch steps, bored out of his mind. He had been staring at the woods for what felt like hours, wondering if there was anything worth exploring out there. Like what? Jamie asked, trying to sound uninterested, but knowing he was already hooked. "I found something," Tommy said, looking around as if making sure no one was listening. "Something out there in the woods. You ever hear about the old cabin?" Jamie shook his head. He had lived in the area all his life, but there was no mention of any cabin in the woods. "It's just a little ways from here," Tommy continued. "Not too far, just a couple of miles, deep in the trees. They say it's been abandoned for years, but I found it, and I think it's worth checking out." Jamie hesitated. The woods were dense, and once you went too deep, it was easy to get lost. His grandparents had always warned him to stay out of certain areas, especially those far off the beaten path. But something about Tommy's invitation stirred a curiosity in Jamie. He wanted to see what was so special about this cabin. "Okay, let's go," Jamie said, standing up. Tommy grinned. "I knew you'd be up for it." They set off right away, grabbing a couple of flashlights and bottles of water from the kitchen. It was already late in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the sounds of crickets chirping in the distance. The woods were different at night. During the day, they were a familiar place, a patchwork of trees and paths that Jamie had explored countless times as a child. But at night, the trees seemed to close in, the shadows longer and deeper. The further they walked, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie stillness that Jamie couldn't shake. Tommy led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The trail was narrow, overgrown with brambles and thick vines that tugged at their clothes as they moved forward. Jamie could feel his heart beating faster, not from exertion, but from an unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. "You're sure about this cabin?" Jamie asked, his voice a little more cautious now. Tommy glanced over his shoulder, his grin widening. "Yeah, don't worry. It's not far now." They walked in silence for a few more minutes, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. The air seemed heavier here, as though the trees themselves were closing in on them. Finally, they reached a clearing, and there it was, a small, decrepit cabin sitting in the center of the space. The roof was sagging, and the windows were boarded up with old, rotting planks of wood. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door hung loosely on its hinges, barely attached to the frame. Jamie felt a chill run down his spine as they approached. He had always been told to stay away from places like this, places that were out of sight, out of mind. But now, standing in front of the cabin, he couldn't help but feel an undeniable pull. Tommy pushed the door open with a creak, and it swung inward with a dull groan. Inside, the air smelled stale and musty, like a place that hadn't seen the light of day in years. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, and the faintest trace of mildew lingered in the air. "You sure this is safe?" Jamie asked, looking around nervously. "It's fine," Tommy said, stepping inside and shining his flashlight around. "It's just an old house, nothing more." Jamie followed, his footsteps heavy as he crossed the threshold. As soon as he was inside, the door slammed shut behind him, sending a jolt of panic through his chest. Tommy turned quickly, but there was no sign of any wind, no reason the door should have closed so suddenly. "Did you do that?" Jamie asked, his voice rising. Tommy shrugged, looking equally puzzled. No, but that was weird. They both stood in the darkness for a moment, the only light coming from their flashlights. The house seemed to be holding its breath, the air thick with a sense of dread. So, what's the story with this place? Jamie asked, trying to shake off the growing feeling of unease. I don't know. I heard people say it's haunted, but I didn't believe it, Tommy said. But there's something off about this place, I'll admit. Jamie swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the room, for there were old furniture pieces covered in dust, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. A rocking chair sat in the corner, the wood warped with age. There were strange markings on the walls, carvings that looked like they had been scratched into the surface long ago. Then, from the back of the room, there was a faint sound, a creak, a shuffle. Jamie froze, his blood running cold. It wasn't the house settling, it was something else. Did you hear that? Jamie whispered. Tommy's face was pale. Yeah, let's go. He moved quickly toward the door, but as soon as he reached for the handle, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. Tommy? Jamie's voice cracked. There was no response. Panicking, Jamie fumbled for his flashlight, turning it on again just as something moved in the corner of his vision. His heart raced as he swung the light in that direction. Nothing. Jamie, let's get out of here. Tommy's voice was shaky, urgent. But before they could reach the door, a low, guttural sound filled the room, like something scraping along the floor. It was slow, deliberate. And then, from the darkness, a shape began to emerge. A figure, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It wasn't human. The flashlight flickered again, casting fleeting shadows that danced along the walls. The thing moved toward them, its hollow eyes locked onto Jamie, his breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in terror. The figure reached out with long, bony fingers, and in that instant Jamie knew they were not alone in that cabin. Before he could react, the figure lunged. Everything went black. When Jamie woke up, he was outside. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the woods. His head throbbed, and his body ached. He was lying on the ground near the clearing, Tommy nowhere in sight. Jamie scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling. He searched the area, calling out for Tommy, but there was no answer. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed. The trees were just trees, and the clearing was empty. There was no trace of the place they had been. Panic set in. Jamie ran back to his grandparents' house, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, his grandparents were already up, sitting at the kitchen table. Jamie, his grandmother said, her voice soft. Where have you been? We've been worried sick. He didn't answer right away. The images of the cabin, the figure, Tommy's disappearance, it all felt like a nightmare. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something had happened out there in the woods, something he couldn't explain. And it wasn't over. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The summer of 2007 is one that I will never forget, though I wish I could. I had just turned 19. And like many people my age, I was desperate for adventure. My cousin Jake had been working at a small lakeside cabin resort in the Adirondacks for the past few summers, and when he invited me to join him for the season, I didn't hesitate. The idea of living in the mountains for 3 months, surrounded by forests, water, and new people, sounded perfect. Little did I know that the beauty of the place would soon turn into a nightmare. The resort was nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was a family-owned operation with only a handful of seasonal staff working the property. The cabins were rustic but cozy, and they sat along the shore of a pristine, crystal-clear lake. There was something tranquil about the place, especially in the mornings, when the mist would rise off the water and everything seemed still, like time itself had slowed down. I couldn't have imagined a more peaceful location. I arrived in mid-June, right at the start of the tourist season. The drive was long, winding, and isolated, with barely any signs of civilization as we went further into the woods. Jake met me at the staff cabin where I'd be staying. It was small but comfortable, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with mismatched furniture. I was excited to start the new chapter, and Jake seemed glad to have company for the summer. He had been a little too isolated for my liking, always talking about how the place had a way of getting into your head. Over the next few days, I got to know the other staff members. Sarah, the quiet but friendly lifeguard, Ethan, the outgoing bartender, and Mark, the grumpy maintenance guy. They all seemed normal enough, and the atmosphere at the resort was relaxed. It wasn't until my third night there that things started to feel off. It happened just after midnight. I had been sitting outside on the porch, sipping a beer and enjoying the cool night air. The stars were incredibly bright in the Adirondacks, and then the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filled the silence. But then I heard something, an odd rustling coming from the woods near the lake. It wasn't the usual night sounds, like the scurrying of animals or the wind moving through the trees. This was deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. I dismissed it at first. It was probably a deer or some other animal, I thought. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate walk. I stood up and looked out into the darkness, but saw nothing. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy of trees, and the shadows seemed to swallow everything. I felt a chill run down my spine. The sounds had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the isolation getting to my head. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, scratching at the walls, faint whispers in the wind. Every time I drifted off, a sudden sound would jerk me awake. The next morning, I felt drained, but didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid. The following days passed in a blur. The resort became busier as the summer season gained momentum. But strange things kept happening. One morning, I woke up to find my car keys missing, even though I had left them on the kitchen counter. Another time, I noticed a set of muddy footprints leading up to the back door of the cabin, even though no one had been outside the night before. It wasn't just me. The other staff members started to notice things too. Sarah told me that she'd heard voices at the lifeguard station late at night, though no one had been there. Ethan had seen someone standing in the shadows near the bar one evening, only to turn around and find the spot empty when he went to check. Mark, the maintenance guy, found strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the cabins, though he never told anyone else about it. The tension in the air was growing, but nobody could explain what was happening. Jake, who had been working at the resort for years, seemed to take it in stride, though I could see the stress building in his eyes. One night, I pulled him aside to ask if he'd ever experienced anything like this. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but I've learned to ignore it. You just don't go into the woods at night, that's all." "Why?" "What's out there?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. Jake's face grew pale. "There's something about this place. I don't know if it's the land or the water or something else, but you don't want to mess with it." I pressed him for more details, but he wouldn't say anything else. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the woods. It felt like the trees themselves were alive, pressing in on the cabin. A few days later, on a warm afternoon, we had a group of tourists staying at the resort. They were a family: mom, dad, 2 kids who had rented one of the cabins for the weekend. By evening, the kids had wandered off toward the lake while the parents enjoyed drinks on the porch. When I went down to check on them, I saw something strange by the water. The kids were standing at the edge of the lake, staring at something in the water, unmoving. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. The sun was setting and the shadows were growing longer, but something about the scene unsettled me. The kids' faces were blank, as if they were in some kind of trance. I hurried down to them, feeling a sense of dread gnaw at my gut. As I got closer, the older of the 2 kids, about 10 years old, turned slowly to face me. "Don't look," he whispered. I froze, confused. "Don't look at what?" But before he could answer, I heard something moving in the water. A ripple spread out from the center of the lake, as though something large was moving beneath the surface. And my heart started to race. I glanced back at the kids, but they were still staring, their eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Or awe. I didn't know. Suddenly, the little boy turned and ran back toward the cabin, but his sister stood frozen, still staring at the water. I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away, but she wouldn't budge. She was stiff as a board, her gaze locked on the lake. "That thing's coming," she said, her voice cold and distant. I pulled harder, finally yanking her away from the water. The last thing I saw before we left the shore was a shape, dark and indistinct, moving slowly through the water. It was massive, but it had no form I could recognize, just a vague, shifting mass of shadows and ripples. My breath caught in my throat as we retreated back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The air felt thick with something unspoken, something ancient. The whispers I had heard before were louder now, coming from the woods. It wasn't just the trees this time. It felt like the entire forest was alive, watching, waiting. The sound of footsteps, the same rhythmic pattern from days earlier, returned. Only this time it was closer, as if something was just outside the window, waiting for me to look. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave. The next morning, I packed up my things and tried to leave the resort, but as I started my car, it stalled. Again, I tried restarting it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I got out and checked the hood, but everything seemed fine. There was no reason for it to be dead. That's when I saw Jake walking toward me from the woods, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Don't leave," he said, his voice shaking. "I know you've heard it too, the thing in the water. It's not just a story. It's real." I stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Jake glanced around nervously, as though expecting someone to hear. "It's been here for longer than anyone can remember. People who stay too long, they hear it, they see it, they vanish. Or worse." I didn't know what to say. My hands were shaking as I looked at the car, which refused to start. The feeling of being trapped in that place with something watching me from the water grew unbearable. And then from the trees I heard the whispers again. But this time, they weren't just in my head. They were coming from all around me, from the woods, from the water. The ground beneath my feet seemed to hum with a low, vibrating sound. I could feel it in my bones. Jake looked at me one last time before he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I never saw him again. When they found the car the next day, it was empty. No sign of Jake, no sign of the family that had stayed in the cabin, just a single set of footprints leading into the forest and disappearing. They say the place is cursed now. People avoid it, but sometimes if you're in the area late at night, you might hear the whispers just on the edge of hearing, coming from the lake. If you listen too closely, you might just disappear. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was the kind of summer evening that seemed to stretch on forever. The kind that made you want to stay outside until the very last breath of daylight had faded. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the occasional sound of crickets added to the background of a quiet, peaceful night. I had spent the entire day swimming at the lake, soaking in the sun, and I had the promise of a lazy evening ahead, sitting on the porch with my friends, watching the stars. But that night, something changed, something I can't explain. I had always been fond of the quiet solitude of our cabin. My family had rented it every summer for as long as I could remember. It was tucked away in the mountains, miles from any other houses or roads. The lake shimmered in the distance, nestled in the crook of a valley surrounded by towering trees. The place was old but well kept, 2 stories of wooden beams and wide windows that overlooked the forest. It wasn't large, but it was homey, and it always felt like the perfect escape. That year, I wasn't alone. I had invited my childhood friends, Kate and Lucas, to join me. They had both agreed to spend a week with me at the cabin, to relive those carefree summers of our youth. We were all in our early 20s now, but some habits died hard. It was our tradition. The first few days had passed in a blur. The lake was cold but refreshing, the campfires were warm, and we stayed up late, drinking beers and reminiscing about our past. Nothing seemed unusual, except for the increasing stillness that seemed to hang over the place. The kind of quiet that was almost oppressive. It was on the 3rd night that I first noticed something strange. We were sitting on the porch, the 3 of us, with a bottle of wine and a pack of cards. The night was warmer than usual, but the air was still crisp. The stars above us seemed to blink in the darkness, their light faint against the backdrop of the mountains. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the soft croon of a night bird somewhere far off in the distance. Lucas was telling a story, his hands animated as he spoke, when I felt it. A cold breeze that swept across my skin, carrying with it the faintest scent of something unfamiliar. It wasn't the usual smell of pine or the fresh, earthy scent of the woods. No, this had something else to it, something sharp, like metal. I frowned and looked around, but saw nothing out of place. Do you smell that? I asked, interrupting Lucas mid-sentence. Kate and Lucas both paused, their faces turning toward me. Smell what? Kate asked, her brow furrowed. That. I trailed off, unsure how to describe it. It smells like iron or something. Kate sniffed the air, but Lucas only shook his head, not registering anything unusual. I don't smell anything, Lucas said. We shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the wind carrying something from the lake or the trees. We went back to our conversation, but the feeling lingered. There was something about that smell, something unsettling that gnawed at the back of my mind. The next day, we decided to take a hike into the woods. The forest around the cabin was dense, full of towering trees and thick underbrush. We had walked these trails countless times before, but today the air felt different, heavier. The usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, the rustling of leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin prickle. We pushed on, making our way deeper into the forest, our footsteps crunching the dry leaves beneath us. The path had always been well worn, but as we walked, I noticed that the trail seemed less clear. The branches were more tangled, the trees thicker. It was as if the woods were closing in around us. We reached a clearing after what felt like hours. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and the light in the clearing was dim, the shadows long and deep. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat rock, and upon it sat something that immediately caught my attention. An old, weathered wooden box. It was strange. I hadn't seen it before, and I didn't remember there being anything like it the last time I had hiked this trail. I walked over to it, curious. The box was small, maybe a foot wide, with intricate carvings along the sides. The wood had darkened over the years, worn smooth by the elements. It looked ancient. Check this out, I said, crouching beside it. Kate and Lucas walked over to inspect it, their curiosity piqued. What do you think it is? Kate asked. I don't know, I replied, my fingers brushing against the carvings. There was something about it that felt wrong, like it shouldn't be here. The air around the box felt charged, electric, as if it had been sitting here for a reason, waiting for someone to find it. Without thinking, I lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing. At least that's what I thought at first. But then I saw it, a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was tucked in the corner of the box, hidden beneath a layer of dust. I pulled the paper out, carefully unfolding it. The writing was faded, the ink barely legible, but the message was clear. Stay away. He's coming. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I read the words again, then handed the paper to Kate and Lucas. They looked at it, exchanging uneasy glances. Who do you think he is? Lucas asked, his voice hesitant. I don't know, I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. But we should leave. Now. The hike back to the cabin felt longer than it had before, and with each step the silence of the woods seemed to press in on us. The wind had picked up, but it was cold now, unnaturally cold for a summer day. It wasn't just the temperature that had changed. The trees, which had once seemed friendly and familiar, now appeared ominous, like they were watching us. When we finally made it back to the cabin, the feeling of unease didn't fade. That night, we stayed inside, locking the doors and closing the windows despite the heat. The air was thick with tension, and none of us spoke much. We tried to laugh it off, but the heaviness in the cabin was suffocating. Around midnight, Kate was the first to hear it. A soft knock at the door. I heard her gasp, and I froze, my heart skipping a beat. We all stood still, listening. Another knock, this time louder, and then another, each one followed by a long pause. Who's there? I asked, my voice barely audible. There was no answer, just the silence stretching on, broken only by the sound of our breathing. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Kate was the one who finally moved. She went to the window and peered out into the dark yard, her face pale in the dim light. I don't see anyone, she said, but her voice was shaky. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. The kind of silence that made you feel like something was lurking just beyond the reach of the light. We waited, but nothing happened. The next day, we packed our things. We didn't say much, but we knew. We knew something was wrong, and none of us wanted to stay another night. As we drove away from the cabin, the feeling of dread lingered. but we didn't speak about it. We never went back. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
It was a typical summer day in 2014 when I first arrived at the cabin, nestled in the mountains of New Hampshire. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months. We needed to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city, to disconnect and spend some time out in nature. The cabin, belonging to one of my friend's uncles, was deep in the woods, far from any other signs of civilization. We drove up together, our car loaded with enough supplies to last a week, all of us eager to leave behind the noise of the city. We arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting an orange glow across the forest. The air was cool and fresh, and the distant sound of birds and rustling leaves created an almost eerie sense of quiet. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and a porch that overlooked a small lake. The area around the cabin was surrounded by thick woods, the kind that felt ancient, as though the trees had seen far more than any of us ever would. My friends and I made a fire, cracked open some beers, and spent the evening talking and laughing as the sky darkened above us. That first night was peaceful, just as we'd hoped. We ate s'mores, told ghost stories, and stayed up far too late. As the fire died down and we all began to head to bed, I couldn't help but notice how unnervingly quiet the woods had become. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind had died down. The kind of silence that presses in on you, almost suffocating, as though the world around you had paused. I tried not to think too much of it and went inside to bed, falling into a restless sleep. The next morning, we woke up early, excited to spend the day hiking and exploring. But when we went outside, we found something strange, something that would change everything. Scattered across the porch were a series of muddy footprints. They weren't human, but they were large, heavy prints, almost like the tracks of some kind of large animal, but nothing we had seen before. They led from the edge of the woods to the cabin and stopped right at the door. We all stared at them, unsure of what to make of it. No one had come near the cabin, and no one had been outside since the night before. "Well, that's creepy," Sarah, one of my friends, said, her voice tense. The prints seemed fresh, and though we could see no sign of a break-in or any damage to the cabin, the fact that something had been lurking so close to where we had been sleeping the night before was unsettling. We decided to ignore it for the moment and chalk it up to some wild animal, maybe a bear or a moose, passing through. Still, there was a lingering sense of unease. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. The trail led us through thick trees and over rocky streams, and for a while it was exactly the escape we needed. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the forest floor. It was beautiful. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then I would turn around. Sure, I'd seen something moving in the trees behind us, but when I looked, there was nothing there. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky again, and the strange sense of being watched had only intensified. As we cooked dinner, we heard it. Footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. They came from the porch, just like the night before. This time, we were all awake, and we all heard it. A series of heavy steps, the sound of something large moving across the wood. We froze. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound calm, though I could feel my heart racing in my chest. "It's probably just an animal." But I didn't believe it. The sound was too deliberate, too human. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and none of us were eager to investigate. We stayed inside that night, locking all the doors and windows. We tried to keep the mood light, but the unease lingered in the air, like a heavy fog we couldn't shake. We kept the lights on, the noise of the TV or music filling the silence as if trying to block out the sounds of the night. Around midnight, we heard the footsteps again. This time they were much closer. They were at the door, slow, heavy, and methodical. Something was out there. I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the door, motioning for the others to stay behind. As I stepped outside, the night air hit me, cold and still. My flashlight beam swept across the porch, illuminating the footprints again. But there was something else. There, on the wooden steps, was a smear of something dark, almost like blood. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The blood was fresh, and the trail seemed to lead into the forest. But I wasn't alone. As I turned back to the cabin, I saw Mark standing behind me, his face pale. "What is that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, there was a loud rustling in the trees. Something large moved through the brush, branches snapping as it came closer. I shone the flashlight in the direction of the noise, but it was too dark to see anything. "We need to go inside," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Now." We rushed back inside and locked the door. Everyone was silent as we waited, the only sound the beating of our hearts. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It felt like the forest itself was pressing in on the cabin, suffocating us with its presence. That night, none of us slept. We sat in the living room, armed with anything we could find, flashlights, kitchen knives, a couple of bottles of whiskey, and we waited. The night stretched on, the tension thick and suffocating, and still, the footsteps did not return. By morning, we were all on edge. We packed up our things as quickly as we could, but none of us felt safe. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the thought of staying another night in that cabin was unbearable. We decided to leave. But as we were loading up the car, I happened to look back at the cabin, and there, standing on the porch, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was watching us. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. We didn't waste another second. We piled into the car, and as we sped down the mountain road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The woods seemed darker now, more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. It wasn't until years later that I heard the story. A local told me that the area was known for strange disappearances, hikers who wandered off the trail and were never seen again, people who heard things in the woods but could never explain what they were. It seemed like the forest had a way of taking people, of pulling them into the darkness. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. To this day, every time I hear a rustling in the trees or a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I can't help but think about what we saw that summer night. And sometimes when the wind is still and the world is too quiet, I swear I can still hear the footsteps outside the cabin, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was the summer of 2004 and the heat was unbearable. The kind of summer where you can feel the sticky humidity pressing in from all sides, suffocating you, where the sun burns down so fiercely that it feels like it's slowly cooking the earth. For most people, it was a time of vacations, barbecues, and swimming in the lake. But for my cousin Sarah and me, it was different. We were just starting to discover the darker side of the world, the side we had been warned about but never really believed existed. Our family owned a cabin in the woods, a place that had always been a retreat for us, a sanctuary where we could escape the noise of everyday life. My parents, Sarah's parents, and a handful of our extended family members would visit every year to unwind. It was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and a perfect place to disconnect from the chaos of the outside world. But this year was different. It started with an odd feeling in the air. The cabin itself looked the same as it always had. The large wooden structure sat on the edge of a small, calm lake, its tall windows looking out onto the forest. The smell of pine trees and fresh earth filled the air, and the lake was still enough to reflect the blue sky above like a mirror. Everything was peaceful. But there was something about the atmosphere that felt off. Sarah and I had always been close, practically inseparable, and this summer was no different. We spent most of our days swimming, exploring the woods, and just being kids. But over the course of the first few days, I started to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched when we were out in the woods, like someone or something was lurking just beyond the trees. The quiet, unsettling stillness that followed us as we walked around the cabin. The sounds of twigs snapping behind us, but when we turned to look, nothing was there. I tried to brush it off, as my imagination getting the better of me. After all, I had grown up in those woods, and nothing had ever happened. My parents and cousins had been coming to the cabin for years, and we'd never had any issues. But Sarah felt it too. I could tell by the way she kept looking over her shoulder when we walked around the property. She'd stop talking mid-sentence and stare off into the trees, her eyes wide with unease. We decided one evening to venture deeper into the forest. It was a late afternoon, and the sky was beginning to turn a deep shade of orange, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward a trail that led to an old, abandoned homestead deep in the woods. My dad had told me stories about the place, about how it used to belong to a family who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. He always warned me not to go near it, but Sarah and I were curious. We didn't tell anyone we were going. We were determined to explore on our own to see if the stories were true. The trail was overgrown, the trees arching above us like dark sentinels. The air felt thick, and there was an unnatural quiet around us, as if the forest was holding its breath. As we got closer to the homestead, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The trees around us seemed to close in, the path narrowing. My flashlight flickered, casting odd shadows on the trees. It was hard to tell if the light was malfunctioning or if something was blocking it. When we finally reached the homestead, it looked even more dilapidated than I had imagined. The house was a rotting shell of its former self, its windows broken and its roof caving in. The porch sagged dangerously, and the front door hung loosely from one hinge. The place had an oppressive, decaying smell, like something that had been left to rot for far too long. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. I felt the same way, but I didn't want to admit it. I had been the one pushing for this, and I didn't want to show fear. But there was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned my flashlight toward the front door and saw a strange, faded symbol carved into the wood. It was crude, almost like a warning, but it was so faded, so old, that it didn't seem like it belonged there. "What do you think it means?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know, but the symbol unsettled me. We stood there for a few moments, our flashlights casting long shadows against the walls of the house. Then, we heard something. A low sound, almost like a groan, coming from inside the house. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine. The sound didn't belong to the wind or an animal. It was a human sound, deep and guttural, as if someone or something was trapped inside. "We should go," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." I didn't argue. We turned and started walking quickly back toward the trail, the sound of our footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. But as we walked, I heard something else, soft, almost imperceptible footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. I stopped. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear. She nodded. "We're not alone." We stood frozen for a moment, the fear so thick I could almost taste it. And then, from behind us, came a loud crash, like something had fallen to the ground. We turned, but there was nothing, just the empty, darkened path behind us. Without a word, we both took off running and tried, not caring where we were going, just as long as it was away from whatever was following us. The forest seemed to shift around us as we ran, the trees blurring in the darkness, the ground uneven beneath our feet. I could hear Sarah's heavy breathing behind me and my own heart pounding in my chest. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, until we reached the clearing where the cabin was. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for air, my hands shaking. Sarah was right behind me, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, still trying to catch my breath. "But we need to tell someone." We didn't tell anyone that night. We couldn't. The fear was too raw, too fresh. We tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hearing creaks and groans as if the house itself was alive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that symbol on the door, and I heard those footsteps. The next morning, we went to the cabin's porch to gather ourselves, the sun shining down through the trees. But something was wrong. The woods felt different, quieter. The usual chirping of birds was absent. The air felt colder, like the warmth had been sucked out of the day. We went to tell our parents what had happened, but when we tried to explain, no one seemed to take us seriously. They brushed it off, saying we were just scared kids, that the woods had a way of playing tricks on your mind. My uncle even laughed, saying it was probably just a raccoon or a deer. But Sarah and I knew what we had heard, what we had felt. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't normal. It wasn't just the creaking of an old house or the sounds of animals. There was something darker out there in the woods. That night, we decided to go back. We had to. We had to know what it was, what was hiding out there. We made our way to the homestead again, but this time it was different. The air was thick with dread, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we approached the house. When we got to the door, it was wide open, and that symbol was fresh again, as if someone had just carved it. I wanted to turn around to leave and never come back, but Sarah stepped forward, her expression grim. "Whatever's out there," she said, "we need to find out what it is." We stepped inside, and that's when we heard it. The sound of footsteps, the same slow, deliberate steps from before. This time they weren't behind us. They were coming from upstairs. Without a word, we began to climb the stairs, our flashlights flickering in the darkness. As we reached the top, we saw a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was heavy with something, an oppressive presence that seemed to press down on us. I pushed the door open. What we saw inside was something we could never explain. The room was empty, but the walls were covered in symbols, scratched into the wood with something sharp. In the center of the room was a small altar, and on it lay something, a doll. It was old, its face cracked and warped, its eyes staring blankly ahead. But as soon as we stepped into the room, we heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't English, it wasn't any language we recognized, but the sound was unmistakable. It was calling us, and that's when we realized there was no going back. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The summer of 2012 was supposed to be a break from everything. After finishing my sophomore year of college, I felt like I had earned a few weeks of peace and quiet. So, when my Uncle Frank offered me a job at his lakeside cabin in the Catskills, I jumped at the opportunity. He had a small property up there, just a few cabins nestled in the trees by a beautiful remote lake. The job was simple enough: help out with maintenance, clean up after guests, and generally assist him during the busy summer season. At first, everything seemed perfect. I arrived at the cabin in mid-June, the air warm but not yet oppressive. The drive up was long but scenic, through twisting mountain roads lined with tall trees that seemed to close in on the car as I went further into the mountains. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already late in the evening, and the sun was dipping behind the hills. The lake was serene, its surface reflecting the pastel colors of the sky. Uncle Frank was waiting for me on the porch, a big grin on his face. "Good to see you, kid," he said, clapping me on the back. "This is going to be a good summer." The cabin itself was rustic but charming. It had a large open-plan living area, a stone fireplace that took up one wall, and a kitchen that smelled of pine and wood smoke. The bedrooms were small but comfortable, each with a window that opened to the sounds of the forest. My room, which was upstairs, overlooked the lake. It felt like the perfect place to escape the noise and pressure of school and the city. The first few days were blissfully normal. I helped Uncle Frank with minor repairs, replacing a few shingles on the roof, patching up a couple of leaky pipes, and spent the evenings watching sunsets by the lake. Occasionally, some guests would check in: couples, families, a few solo travelers looking for a weekend getaway. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional call of a loon from the water. But then, as the days wore on, something strange started happening. It started with the lights. One evening, about a week into my stay, I was sitting on the porch reading a book when I noticed that the lights inside the cabin flickered. It was subtle at first, just a brief flash. I thought it was nothing, probably just a power surge or a loose connection. But the flickering kept happening, intermittent, like the lights were struggling to stay on. I went inside to check the fuse box, but everything seemed normal. No tripped circuits, no signs of any malfunction. I shrugged it off and went back outside, only to notice that the lights inside had gone out completely. The whole cabin was dark. Uncle Frank was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and hadn't noticed the power cut, so I decided to head out to the shed to grab a flashlight. The cabin was still silent, save for the distant sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional splash from the lake. As I passed by the back door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. a shadow, moving across the porch. I froze, squinting into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch light. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My heart started racing, and I felt an uneasy chill crawl up my spine. The darkness felt thicker now, more oppressive, and the rustling of the trees sounded louder, like they were shifting under some unseen weight. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling. "It's just the woods," I muttered to myself. "Nothing to be scared of." I grabbed the flashlight from the shed and returned to the cabin, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. Later that night, as I was lying in bed, the sound of footsteps woke me. Soft, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking slowly around the cabin. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The footsteps continued, steady, measured. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight, and Uncle Frank was fast asleep in his room downstairs. I crept quietly to the window and peered out into the yard, but there was no one there. The moonlight illuminated the space around the cabin, casting long shadows over the grass, but it was empty. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sound of footsteps echoed in my mind. And then I heard it again, the rustling outside. Not footsteps this time, but something moving through the grass. It was slow, almost like a dragging sound. I couldn't help it. I had to see what it was. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept out of my room. I walked down the stairs, careful not to make any noise. As I reached the door, I heard a soft knock. My blood ran cold. I stopped dead in my tracks. Another knock. This time it was louder. I opened the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The air outside was cool, and the night seemed even darker than usual. I shined the flashlight around the porch, but there was no one there. Only the dark outline of the trees and the glistening surface of the lake. My pulse slowed, and I stepped outside, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. But then I saw something near the edge of the trees. It was a figure, barely visible, standing just inside the forest. It was tall, too tall, and unmoving. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't look human, though it was hard to say why. Something about the way it stood, too still, too quiet, sent a surge of fear through me. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no clothing. It was just a dark silhouette blending with the shadows of the trees. I wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat. My feet felt like they were cemented to the ground. I couldn't look away from it, even though every instinct told me to run. The figure remained motionless, as if waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second there, and the next, vanished into the dark woods. I slammed the door shut and bolted the lock behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced. What had I just seen? I couldn't explain it. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, some illusion caused by shadows, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with this place, something lurking in the woods, waiting. The next day, I didn't mention anything to Uncle Frank. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make its move. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. The lights flickered again, and I heard more footsteps at night. This time, not just around the cabin, but near the lake as well. Sometimes I thought I heard voices, faint murmurs just beyond the edge of hearing, like whispers carried on the wind. But whenever I tried to find the source, there was nothing. One evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a walk by the lake to clear my head. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the water. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. As I walked along the shore, I noticed something in the water, something dark, moving beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of a tree, but as I focused, it was something larger, too large. I froze, staring at the spot, unable to look away. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it, a shape, a shadow, just beneath the surface of the water. It was unmistakably humanoid in form, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to stretch and contort. I stumbled back, my heart racing. My feet seemed to have a mind of their own as I turned and ran back to the cabin, not daring to look behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, scratching at the door, the sounds of something dragging across the floor. I pressed my back against the headboard, trying to stay as still as possible, but the noises didn't stop. It was as if something was trying to get inside. I could feel it, just beyond the door, waiting for me to fall asleep. The next morning, I told Uncle Frank about everything. The footsteps, the figure by the trees, the shape in the water. He didn't say anything at first, just listened quietly, his face serious. When I finished, he finally spoke. "You're not the first one to see it," he said, his voice low. "This place, it has a history. Something happened here a long time ago. People come and go, but there are some who never leave. Some things are better left alone." I had no idea what he meant. But as the days went by, I realized that whatever it was, whatever haunted that place, wasn't done with me yet. The following night, I left the cabin for good. I packed my things in a hurry, too scared to stay another minute. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were closing in on me. I didn't tell Uncle Frank. I didn't know what I would say. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the trees, watching. Story the end.